Uh-huh,
on some issues.
uh-huh.
And I'm such an ag area, so I got
Test,
water.
testing one, two.
Good,
And then I still get to use
Yep.
stuff my the first session of you.
good. That's
So,
cool.
yeah. Yeah. The next committee is ag.
Uh-huh.
It's here again in this room.
Oh, in the
Alan, you're
same room?
screaming. It's a.
And so, I mean, it was so fun.
All by yourself?
I felt like I was in the principal's office. I got to go sit by the teacher. So, how do you think, with what you're dealing with at work,
Uh-huh.
how do you think things are going? I mean, do you think that we're going to do anything for the mentally?
I hope, but, you know, they're so far behind.
Yeah.
You know, that we can't, it's gonna take several years for us to catch them up to where they were in the nineties. Because so much of their funding's been stripped away.
And it continues to multiply.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and then with the pandemic, it's even worse.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I do apologize for the delays. We're still having some technical issues in different areas. I will apologize to all the members that you do not have the 2 pieces of testimony today electronically because of some glitches that happened upstairs. So I think our presenters will do a good job, and then as soon as Carmen has that, she will make sure that you all get copies of it. We just don't have a choice, and I didn't want to cancel the meeting today, so I do apologize for that. We have some bill introductions. Whitney Dameron, I believe you have a bill that you'd like to introduce.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Whitney Dameron, appearing today on behalf of the Kansas Psychological Association, which is a doctoral level PhD psychologist, requesting introduction of 21 RS 0265 to allow for legislation known as PsyPact, which is essentially the ability to provide or deliver psychological services via telecommunications.
All right, any questions? Seeing none.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
It's brought in. I believe Representative Arnberger, you have a bill introduction?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I am introducing our 21 RS 0119, which is on behalf of the Board of Cosmetology. They have some updates they'd like to do.
All right, any discussion? Nope, seeing none, we're good. Anyone else with a bill introduction? I recognize Representative Epley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to introduce the step therapy bill from last year that we considered, and it was Old House Bill 2120. The new RS number for this bill is 21 RS 0115. It involves medical step therapy, and I think it would be good for us to give this consideration again in this session. Thank you.
Questions? Bill introduced. Are there any further bill introductions? All right, seeing none. We'll start off with our first conferee today. Committee, we thought it would be a good idea to have a discussion on some of the testing and other questions that you may have about COVID. And so we're fortunate to have Dr. Antonios. I keep wanting to say San Antonios because I deal with San Antonio on a mental health project. So if I pronounce your name wrong during this process, doctor, I do apologize to this. But he's their I call him the COVID expert. He's probably got a better title than that from the Wichita area and for Ascension, which is Via Christi and St. Francis, and then a few other hospitals across the state. So welcome to committee, Dr. Antonios.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for having me today. I wanted to ask just a clarifying question. If I needed to project anything, or you have a copy of what I'm about to present?
We do not have your copy, not because you didn't send it. Bruce has sent it several times. I've sent it several times, and we're just having a glitch. So we'll just let you go through what you were going to present, and then we'll get that to the committee members later.
Sure. Yeah. So again, thank you very much for having me. If you have any issues with my audio, please let me know. Hopefully everything will go okay. I've been asked to kind of talk a little bit about testing today, and so I'll touch base on that, but I want to make sure that I am available for any other questions you may have from a clinical perspective or about what we're dealing with Ascension Via Christi. And thank you for the introduction. My name is Sam Antonios. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer for Ascension Via Christi. I was going to cover a little bit the topic of testing by introducing the types of testing that currently exist on the market. There are 3 main testing modalities, and those are really the 3 that healthcare professionals deal with. The first one is something called PCR. Sometimes you might have been heard or referred to as a nucleic acid amplification or molecular test. This test is considered the gold standard. It is what detects the genetic material very specific to COVID-19 in a sample, which usually is from a swab. There is another type of test that has surfaced over the course of last year, and that's referred to as the antigen test. And this one is really only detecting a piece of protein that's on the surface of the virus, and it also comes from a swab. The third test that you might have heard about is an antibody test. And that's a test that is in the blood, so it's not from a nasal swab. And that one is looking at molecules that the body have developed in order to fight the virus. I want to make a note here that's important. People have used the term rapid, but there's really no such thing as a rapid test in the way amongst those three. Each one of those three can be a rapid. Rapid rapidity is about the speed by which the test is performed, not a particular methodology. It's really more of a commercial term. The FDA doesn't really have a definition for rapid. It's more when something is sensed to be of a short duration, the result come back quickly. That's called a rapid. But if you ever hear something called rapid, that's not really referring to a particular type of test. All three can be rapids or not. So like I mentioned earlier, the gold standard is considered the PCR test, which is detecting the genetic material that's inside a virus. And that's the test that has by and large been performed. And that's the one that we would recommend. There are a few situations where the antigen test can be attractive, and that's really in settings where the stakes are not as high, I would say. Also, when it's probably being used in other countries where it's become cheaper for them to be able to do the antigen test, but there's caveats to it because of the fact that there is if it's positive, it's actually pretty good. If it's negative, there's still a certain degree of uncertainty about the result. The antibody test is really reserved to only what's kind of a seroprevalence studies. It's really not done generally in individuals to diagnose them because it only becomes back positive after 14 or 15 days of someone. So it's really not helpful in the acute phase to tell if someone is infected and they need to go in quarantine or not. And I will also mention about quarantine because I think that was one of the topics that I was asked to touch base on. So testing is important as it relates to quarantine because of the following. Quarantine is really just a risk mitigation strategy. It's not a perfect strategy, but what it does, it reduces the spread of contagious illnesses. And that's existed even before COVID-19, whenever a disease is contagious. Because the symptoms of COVID-19 are not that specific, and in some people there are no symptoms, what the testing, getting a test done can help tell someone if they are exposing others and they need to go in quarantine for the amount of time that they need to, or if it comes back negative from a quality test, such as the PCR, then that actually allows people to still be at work, and then that reduces the impact on businesses and the amount of time that people are out of work. And so we've noticed that the ability to, as much as possible, get a high quality test on someone if they're symptomatic allows them to be back at work and reduces, it's not perfect and sometimes it's not instantaneous, but it can reduce the amount of impact on the workforce and on society as a whole. I hope I covered enough of the topic of testing and quarantine, but like I mentioned earlier, I am open to any question about that, and I'll be happy to try to share my experience. And if I don't know, I'll say I don't know about this topic or anything else.
Thank you, Dr. Antonios. Are there questions, committee? I've got one. I mean, most of the time when we being legislators in different committees, and we've talked about the rapid test, we refer to that one as one that's a swab, and then it's you put it on this credit card looking thing, and then you put a solution on it, and then you get a result in like 15 minutes. I kind of relate it to a pregnancy test. My understanding is with that test out there is that it's 50-50 or less on accuracy. Is that correct?
Well, like I mentioned, I would have to know what exactly is being tested, because that particular example you gave, that could be a PCR or it could be an antigen. Although just hearing the way you're describing it, it seems like it's more of an antigen. And if it is, antigen testing are typically good when they turn positive, but if they turn negative, the degree they have a high false negative. So it could be as high as 50. I would have to know really exactly the test, and I'm happy to look at it and kind of tell you what the studies done on a particular methodology have shown.
Well, these are being used and provided to some of our long-term care facilities in the state in order to test their employees on a regular day. And
Okay.
so the comments that came back to us was, well, if they turn positive, then we have them go take a saliva test or the nasal swab. And
I
if it's
see.
negative, then they do nothing. Well, the problem is if you've got a 50-50 or less chance of it being accurate, you could be positive but get a negative test.
Yes, potentially. Like I said, the other thing that I didn't mention, Madam Chair, is getting a good swab is also important. It's important. Obviously, there has been times when the tests have been approved to only be kind of a shallow, I would say, swab. But we all know that the quality of the swab also matters. And so in some circumstances, the negativity that seems to maybe generate some degree of uncertainty could be related to the quality of the test machine itself, but also related to the quality of the swabbing itself.
Representative Lynn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We've heard a lot of discussions about the number of cycles that are used in the PCR reaction. Do you have a standard for how many you recommend that's necessary?
Generally, that's a good question. It's somewhat technical, so I'll try to avoid the technical here. You know, the PCR machine is trying to search with doing its method to the genetic material that belongs to coronavirus. The cycle time is really referring to these search attempts, so to speak. The machine tries to find it the first time and then doesn't find it, then amplifies the amount of material in there and tries to find it again. Generally, there's a cutoff that the FDA actually approves by each machine that tells you this is what we definitely is a positive, and past this time, we're not gonna consider positive. And so those really will differ machine to machine. Generally, you want it to be a short cycle time, but that hasn't, to be honest, that has not been a concern because of the fact that if you really have a good swab and a good quality vendor machine, the cycle time becomes secondary, is not a major issue, except in a small percentage of cases where the machine takes a long time to detect it, and maybe you don't know, and then you can always just repeat it. And if you repeat it, generally, that gives you an answer.
Are there further questions? Representative Haswood.
Hello, my name is Representative Haswood. I work at the KU COVID call center, so I work a lot with the college students at KU. And one of the questions that we get is, you know, before the students left for winter break, they were able to get a saliva test and then mail it through FedEx. To my understanding, that process of testing and takes a while through the mail and through the USPS system during this winter was a little hectic. Is there any, I guess, negative impact when it goes through the mail system? Is there a viability that happens when it's getting transferred like that?
That's a good question. If you follow the correct, there's a liquid that comes inside the syringe, or I guess the material that's being preserved in, generally that it's okay. It can be viable for a while. Obviously, each machine, each vendor will tell you I would like to see this within 2 days, 5 days, 10 days, 15 days. If it's within that preservative, the correct preservative that comes with each machine, it should be okay. That shouldn't be a concern. Obviously, from a practical perspective, the more there's a delay, the more the individual who's waiting for their result doesn't know whether they're infected. There's this period of uncertainty that's problematic because they may actually feel that they're okay to be others, but they don't really know for a fact. So the more you reduce that period of time, the better from a functioning perspective. But as far as the test itself, if you follow the vendor's recommendation as to which preservative to use and do it correctly, that should be okay.
And what's in the preservative? Because I know when you take the saliva test, it goes in that little tube, and then you close it down, and there's a liquid that preserves the viability of your saliva.
Correct. Yeah.
What's inside the liquid?
Oh, each vendor will have their own formula.
And can you kind of clarify to me why the CDC recommended quarantining for 14 days since the most recent day of contact, which is now updated to, was it 7 days with a negative test and 10 days without a test of no symptoms?
Sure. This is a good question. It's been interesting because the CDC has been trying to do its guidelines based on kind of what the research shows. And I'll try not to go too deep into what this research, but I'm going to start with what I would say is the cornerstone studies, a few studies that were done really early on, probably March, April, that gave the CDC a guidance. They basically identified people who were positive, and they every day were doing on them viral cultures. This is different than the swab. So this is basically a very sophisticated test that is only done with very few labs in the country, where they're trying to culture the virus. Not only detect is it there, they're trying to see how much and if they can isolate it in a culture. They did that every day on those patients. On day 1, day 2, day 3. By day 9, they were unable to detect the virus, period. So it was just impossible for them to get a viral count or anything. Like I said, these are the kind of tests we don't do in our labs. These are sophisticated tests that only done a special test, virology test. Because it was 9 days, after 9 days, it was no possibility to isolate it. They said, the early recommendation early on, they said, if from onset of symptom you wait 10 days, there is really no ability to isolate the virus. And so very low likelihood anybody is making viruses. Obviously, still people were a little bit uncomfortable, but 10 days for a while, we went with 10 days. Later on, because of some degree of uncertainty, is that 10-day really solid? That kind of got extended, really not based on a study, but more from an abundance, I guess, of caution to 2 different criteria. If someone is really sick, they said, okay, 20 days. At 20 days, we really have absolutely no evidence that someone is still going to be contagious. And for someone who's just the moderate symptom, it'll be 10 days. And we still practice that here in the hospital. That's really our guideline. There's a couple of smaller studies that were done after that were kind of challenging the 10-day window because of the fact that they kind of repeated, based on PCR, other studies that found that really the possibility of a positive isolation of a virus between 7 and 10 is not 0, but it's so low that it doesn't justify applying that same rule on everyone. And that's what my understanding is why they modified what you just mentioned. I guess there's one number, if I were to remember one, because I know that it sounds confusing. From onset of symptoms, now I'm not talking about tests, because you could get tested 2 days into your symptoms, right? From onset of symptom, I would memorize the number of 10 days of really needed isolation or quarantine, after which you're really not generating virus and not contagious at that point.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Helps if I turn on my mic. Are there further questions of Dr. Antonios? Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to ask a question about the antibodies. Now that we've been into this for a significant amount of time, I guess I was just curious, does it vary per individual, or do we have a good idea on how long these antibodies are lasting, and are they fading out at a certain point to where the antibodies aren't really effective anymore? I'd just like your opinion on that.
Sure, good question. So I assume you mean by antibodies as the body-generated antibodies from an immune response perspective. Please correct me if that's not what you mean, but yes,
No,
that's been kind
correct.
of, yes, that's been a very interesting area for medicine here, and there's even more focus on it now. We know that the bodies react differently by generating a certain number of antibodies based on a couple of factors. One of them that's very important, and that is what's called inoculum. Inoculum is the amount of virus someone gets exposed to. And so if someone has a massive amount of virus that they get exposed to, their body is generating a large response. And so that's one factor. The other factor is the immune response itself. The immune system in a human being varies by age, other medical conditions, a prior history. So there's the immune response. A third factor that comes into this is prior immune cell activities to maybe other coronaviruses that have, because we know there's other strains that have existed in the community. So in summary, every person's immune response is different. That's what I'm trying to summarize with what I'm mentioning, all of those. Studies have shown that even, it's not incredibly common, but there are people, and we've had a couple of cases here, who after about 90 days, they actually turn positive again. Now, we're seeing lots of patients, but only 2 where that applied to. So that gives you maybe an idea that it's not necessarily too common for people to get infected the first time, become immune, and then after that, their immune response weakens, and then they get infected again. But we know it's not impossible. In fact, we've seen it, and there's lots of reports of that. Because of that, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty, and I may not be able to answer your question, maybe the level of certainty you would wish, but there's still a lot unknown about how long can someone remain immune after being infected. The good news, I guess, is so far, the studies that, and at least to the amount of time that were done by both Pfizer and Moderna, the vaccine seems to have a sustained response. Now, obviously, they started these research only last summer, and so there's still more time that they need to continue to measure and follow up on their patients. But it appears almost as if, and I want to make sure I'm saying this with some degree of uncertainty because that research hasn't been completed yet. It appears as if the vaccine response is actually even better than the natural human response and the immunity. We'll find out more here in the next couple of months. There's some follow-up publications that are expected to come out of both the Pfizer arms and the Moderna arm. And there's a few other studies that are actually focused on specifically the question you want, because I know a lot of people have that on their mind. They want to know, if I got infected, am I just good for life? We already know that we've had examples where people are not immune to life, and after 90 days, they've had a return of their disease. So.
Thank you, doctor. And you actually answered my next follow-up question, which was the longevity of the vaccine. So you read my mind. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, and if I kind of follow along with what you're talking about, doctor, is that they will follow the test patients and see how their immunity is doing with the vaccine, and that's how we will know in advance about when that might expire, like our flu shots and our pneumonia shots, et cetera, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Representative Turner.
Okay, so my question is, what happens when you get a positive on a test? Do they go on a registry? Does it initiate contact tracing?
I believe this is managed by each county health department. A positive person is generally told their response or I'm sorry, their result, and they are told to wait from time of onset. The advice is obviously to be in quarantine for 10 days. Each health department, I believe, manages differently. I'll just speak on what the general concept is. There's someone who knows of the result in the health department. They're telling the patient what to do and their steps they need to take, and they are generally trying to find out who else might be, and that's called contact tracing, who might have been exposed, and trying to create a network of that amount of exposure. I work at a hospital. I can't speak a lot to the inner workings of each health department, how they're working. But I can share with you as an example, if that would be helpful to you. What we do with our employees is we give them that advice. If let's just say we had an employee who tested positive, please stay at home, quarantine, stay away from other family members if you can for 10 days from onset of symptoms, not from test. And then you can come back to work after that.
Doctor, for the employees in our hospitals, from what I understand, is if your coworker that works right beside you tests positive, you don't quarantine the other coworker, and you don't test them unless they show symptoms. Is that correct?
Well, I'll speak a little bit to this. It depends. In our setting, with frontline workers, because of the extreme shortages that have occurred, and because the CDC has designated healthcare frontline workers as essential workers, we may use that scenario that you have outlined, which is you've been exposed, but you don't necessarily have to go home and quarantine. Continue to wear your mask. And you know that we have a universal mandate on masking inside our hospital, and there's also other infection control measures. And so monitor yourself. But that's not always the case, because if it's an employee who can work from home, they can have access to, or it's an area that's not critically short, and we think there is someone else who can cover, we may actually end up doing that. But for the most part, and because it's a designated essential worker area, hospitals are. That's what the CDC actually has on their website as a recommendation, is to monitor symptoms twice a day, which we do, and to connect every day with employee health, which they do.
All right. Representative Epley and Dr. Epley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Doctor, I appreciate all your information today. Thank you. I guess I'd seen something in my literature recently that Moderna is opining that they're stating that they are providing at least 1 year of immunity. And I know the phase 3 trials only ended up sometime in late November, early December. How are they able to make that statement? And that's one question. And part of that, too, is do you think the mRNA vaccines are going to provide better long-term efficacy than the traditional DNA vaccines, just based upon the science behind mRNA vaccines? Thank you.
Sure. So in regards to Moderna, I apologize if I'm not familiar with that particular statement from them. I personally haven't seen it, but I agree with you that you might want to wait a little bit to see before, since the studies didn't really start until this last spring and summer. Maybe that's kind of a premature comment, but I can't speak to it more than that. As far as the mRNA, I've looked at a lot of research about the mRNA, and I just want to make sure I mention that the method for it has not been just designed this year. There has been always an interest because of the impact of SARS that was in Asia several years back, and MERS, which was even worse, and it was in the Middle East and Asia over several years back. There was quite a bit of interest on the methodology of using an mRNA as opposed to another type of vector or adenovirus or any other virus to carry the genetic material. So the research on this is actually quite robust, even though it just so happened that they launched it this year. It had been years in the making, and that was what encouraged me to feel really good about it. In the end, on top of that, I'm going to add the Pfizer and Moderna results are really impressive when it comes to at least what was published when it comes to their efficacy. Something that's kind of interesting. And just as a brief summary, in the end, how we introduce the foreign object so that the body recognizes it and develops immunity to it is, it's still the same concept of vaccine. Vaccine work by giving basically the body a picture or an ID of a organism that we don't want in, and then the body is learning that, memorizing it, so that when they see it, and how we do that, I feel that is right now, at least based on the studies that I've seen, been accomplished with those two companies.
Committee, are there further questions? All right, seeing none. Dr. Antonio, thank you very much for being here with us today, and we appreciate your time, and probably not the last time we'll see you this year.
Sure, anytime. Thank you very much. Thank you for all your work.
All right, thank you. All right, next committee, I have Andy Schlapp with Wichita State University, and I don't know what his title is because I just call him Andy, so you've probably got some fancy title, who knows. Welcome to committee. You want to push the button?
Is that better? They can hear me at home now. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Everybody behind me. Oh, good. That's great. Don't let her know I'm doing this today. So members of the committee, I just want to give you a little background of why Wichita State decided to develop a diagnostic lab. And as I get started, I want you guys to understand that we're using saliva. We can do the nasal pharyngeal as well, but the saliva test we're using is a PCR test. So as we talk about this in the different pieces, I do want you to understand we're doing a PCR test. And one of the things we felt was very, very important was testing. You need to get those results as quick as you possibly can. So one of the things our lab does is guarantee a 24-hour turnaround. So once that test hits our lab, you get that result back in 24 hours. And I will tell you, I use it. I'm a registered collector, and I'm collecting for people in Wichita. I get results back, or they get results back in 2 hours. The longest we've waited is about 8. So really, we feel that testing and getting information as soon as you can to find out if you're positive or negative allows you to make decisions for yourself, your family, your coworkers to be safer as we deal with this disease. In probably October, November of a year ago, so not, 14 months, 15 months ago, there was the grounding of the 737 after 2 aircrafts, and the largest employer in the state of Kansas was talking about shutting down manufacturing. Cessna also had a autoclave explode, and they were also looking at shutting down manufacturing. So we were dealing with a lot of unemployment in Wichita, and we got a group of community leaders together to say, what do we need to do to keep the economy going? We cannot afford to have thousands and thousands and thousands of people laid off. And how do we address that? And we got that turned into, oh, now we're dealing with COVID, right? And so what do we do here? And you go to a manufacturing floor and you say, oh, it's really simple. If you might have been exposed to COVID, you stay home for 14 days, 24 days, 30 days. It changes all the time, right? Well, how do you manufacture and do that? And then you add all the closings of the hairdressers and the retail, and I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the unemployment rate in Sedgwick County and our 10-county region was about double the rest of the state. And so as we're talking about what our response should be and what we need to do, Tanya Witherspoon, who's here with us today, who runs our MDL lab in Wichita, started talking to professors at Harvard, Yale, MIT, the Stowers Institute, about what can we do to at least give people information of, do you have COVID, do you not, and how do we respond to that? So that started in March of 20. And by May, we had decided, she'd put a team together, so Dr. Joel Alderson, who's from Ascension and Via Christine, they're a pathologist and runs CLIA certified labs, came and is our partner, and we have other people that are doing that as well. And we really started talking about what do we need to do, right? And we were dealing with saliva as the answer. Has everybody had a nasopharyngeal test in here? I don't know how long you were crying, but my wife thought I was not anyway, we won't talk about that. But it had to be something that was easy to do. So we started talking about saliva, and it was really met with a lot of hostility that it's not an accurate test, you don't want to do this. And so we actually changed our entire lab to be a nasopharyngeal test, and only to go back and start presenting our nasopharyngeal test to find out that everyone had decided, yeah, saliva is a good way to do this. You should do saliva instead. So we have the privilege of doing both now, which is great. But saliva, to me, is a game changer. And I want to say this again, as we talked a lot about the nasopharyngeal earlier, is that this saliva is a PCR test as well. It's actually the Yale test. I don't know if you know the Yale Saliva Direct. We were actually one of the first labs that Yale said Wichita State can do that as well. So in talking about this, in July, we get the equipment, and Thermo Fisher's the equipment we got, and it's kind of cool. I didn't know that. Thermo Fisher actually opened up a manufacturing plant in Johnson County, so that's actually now a Kansas company, but they're kind of the gold standard of testing, so we can test in multiple parts of the virus to make sure we're getting an accurate result. So anyway, we have this equipment, and then in September, we opened. And then in November, KDHE approved us to be one of the people to provide the test to the community. And so we've really been in a whirlwind to scale up. I don't know, there's a lot of labs that were out there that were already in business. We were not. I want to be clear. We were doing this for one reason and one reason only. The community could not wait for testing, right? And one of the things we were finding is when we did tests, it was 4, 5, 6, 7 days before you got results. Well, you could test, right? Contract, be exposed to somebody who has COVID, be positive, and get your result back and tell you you're negative, right? So that time frame just wasn't realistic to really do anything that mattered. I sit here and go with the legislative session, right? You guys, as your guys are trying to come together and put laws that are important and talk about the important issues of Kansas, you can't be tested and wait 7 days. You need to get responses really, really quickly. So that's a critical piece of all of this. So in November, we started scaling up. We have the ability to do 6,000 tests a day. We are currently doing about 2,500 on average. We get up to as high as about 3,500. And so we have a lot of capacity to go forward. We think that's really, really critical. Excuse me. So I've talked about the test, but I just want to say one of the things we found out with Spirit is they're now testing everybody on a regular basis, right? We're working with 259, the school district. They just took 10,000 tests. They're going to test everybody before they open up again. So now you don't have to make a decision based on fear. We just don't know, right? Hey, you tested positive. You're not coming to school. You tested negative. You can come to school, but we're going to test you again, and we'll make that decision again. So I think all of this helps us make better informed decisions, and I think that's really, really critical. I'll tell one story. It's a personal story. My son, I have a son with autism, pretty severe, doesn't speak, goes to a day program. And here's how contract tracing works in the Schlapp household. You go to Dillon's and you shop, and you're looking, I think I was making a clam chowder, so I was looking for some clams, and this guy comes up to me and says, hey, know him, and I said, how are you doing? He goes, well, dealing with my son, he has COVID. And I went, oh, your son's in my son's day program. Okay, go home, call my wife, and she says, we need to get him tested. And I said, he doesn't have symptoms. Right? He doesn't have a fever, he doesn't have anything. And there's this thing called contract tracing. They're surely going to call us if he's been exposed. So anyway, I call Tanya and say, what should I do? And she says, come to the lab and test. And I do. And guess what? He's positive. Right? So now, how do you quarantine somebody who doesn't understand what they have, right? How do you say, stay away from me? And I did the great thing. I don't know why I'm going to share this story. Early in the morning, I don't have my glasses on. I might have had a mask on and they were fogged up and I couldn't see. I have no idea. But I grabbed his toothbrush and brushed my teeth with his toothbrush, right? And I'm like, great. This is awesome. I for sure have it now. I'm not telling Jane. No. So I'm going around the house going, this is awesome. And I've got all the psychosomatic, right? Oh, I can't taste. I'm sure I got a sore throat. And anyway, test, and I don't have it. Test again. About every 3 days I'm testing. And nobody in our family got it, and our son got it. So again, I get back to the power of getting that information, the power of knowing who's positive and who's not, and what decisions we need to make, right? So Jane's parents are in their 80s. We're negative, but we're probably not having them over for cards, right? We're probably not seeing them. So we could start to make better decisions. And one thing I would say, as we talk about the 10 days, we tested John till he was negative, kept him home, and tested him 2 times to be negative before he went back to school. And that all happened in a week. And I get back to, I'm okay with being cautious and making sure we're not crazy. If it's 10 days or 14 days, what testing does is allow you to make a decision in real time based on data, not on fear or being scared about what might happen. So that's why we did what we're doing. And I just want you to understand one of the things we're doing in collection, we don't want people to come to us. It's hard to take time off work. It's hard to take time away from school. It's hard to get away from your family and go stand in line to get a test. So what we've done at our lab is we've actually gone out to all these organizations and asked them to be collectors. So we trained them. We've trained over 500 organizations in 33 counties in Kansas. And then we send them the supplies they need. They test when they want to and send them to our lab and get a 24-hour turnaround. So to date, we have trained over 2,000 collectors, all doing this for free, all doing this at no cost to them, but because they know it's the right thing to do for their community. So again, that's what we're doing. We're trying to spread that to more parts of the state of Kansas, to more organizations in Kansas, because we believe the more testing you do, the more data you have, the better decisions you can make. And as we talk about the antibody test, Tanya was texting me as I'm up here, and I'm trying not to look at my watch, but we're also in contact with Johns Hopkins, and they are working on an antibody test that's also saliva-based, and we're in contact. When that happens, we'll be able to do that as well. So again, we're looking to the future about what are the things we need to do, because one thing's for certain, vaccine, I hope it works, and I think it will. But for the next couple of years, if you can't taste and you have a fever and you have a cough, no one's going to sit there and go, oh, you know what, you don't have COVID because you had a vaccine. You're still going to test. So this isn't going away for a long period of time. So for us to keep the people working and keep the economy open, testing becomes critical. And one of the things that's really, I think, from a socio point of view is that for me, working at home, not a big deal. I've done it since March 17th, since we closed down the legislative session last year, right? My son who works in the restaurant business and all the people that are working poor, those are the people we tell them, you're not working, stay home, no check, right? Here's $600 every so often. It's really not fair to them. So that's where we get back to testing really becomes critical because it disproportionately hurts those that already can't be hurt any more than they are. And I'll stop and answer any questions you guys have.
Thank you, Andy. Representative Carlson and then Representative Epley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think that's wonderful how you've trained these people to go out and make the testing a lot easier. What is the cost for testing?
What is our cost for testing?
No, the people that are out there. So you've trained these people to gather the tests and stuff. Can anyone go in and have the test?
So that's all up to them, right? They can make that decision on who they want to test and who they don't. We call them bubbles, right? Social bubbles. Who's the bubble? Who do you hang out with? Part of the problem is when you start saying, hey, go to this place, and we have a whole line of everybody, you start mixing all these bubbles together and you get exposed more to COVID, right? So the issue becomes that, so let's talk about the Wichita Chamber. The Wichita Chamber is testing their staff. That's who they've decided. But then they called back and said, there's a lot of small businesses in town that probably aren't going to go through this testing, can we test for them as well? So they're doing this a couple times a week where they, if you're a small business with this many employees or less, on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 10 to noon, come to the chamber parking lot and they'll test. So that really becomes a decision for each organization of who they want to test and how they want to do that.
And if I may, Madam Chair, I'm sorry, but I guess for those that are uninsured, so you're working, and maybe you get in that. So does it cost people, I mean, like, I went and got tested a couple of times. So the first time I went through the hospital, ordered by my doctor. Okay. So the second time I went to a ks.gov in Manhattan. It went through my insurance. My son was tested, no insurance, his was $120.
Right.
There's a lot of people out there that probably should be tested. So is $120 what is normally going to be charged to someone without insurance? I mean, it's hard for me to tell people that you need to go test it, get tested, and then they go, yeah, I can't do that.
So currently, right, so currently with the CARES Act, right, and Sparks dollars, we have $53 million set aside for testing. So anybody using our lab, the testing is free, right? And so we were all worried that that funding would go away by January 31st, right? And it didn't, so it got extended for another year. So you can test for free for another year. And then there's, you know, I forget how much total money is in the second CARES Act for testing again, but Kansas will get roughly another 70 million or in that ballpark. So we'll have enough money to do testing for free. And I believe there's 7 labs that are doing that with CARES dollars right now. So yes, there is plenty of opportunities for people to get their testing for free. And everybody we're signing up right now is signing up under CARES and Spark funding and able to offer those tests for free.
Representative Epley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our small college had to, because they did not get funding for testing, and so they had to come up with something somewhat innovative. It had not met approval yet, but it did during the time they started the testing. That's pooled saliva it's pooled saliva testing for, I believe they test 5 or 10 students at a time, and then if there's one positive, then they go ahead and test the whole group. And that was a pretty efficient way to go. I wondered if you wanted to make any comments about that. And then the last thing I want to ask you about is testing via wastewater testing in large facilities to look in dorms and such as that to look for positive testing for COVID-19. Thank you.
So pool testing is a good way to do it if you're paying, right? So what I would tell you right now with the CARES and Sparks funding, that school, and they could sign up with us, they could get free testing and do it individual. It's the same, to me, when you deal with pool testing, it's helpful. It's an inexpensive way to get a large group of people tested, but it's kind of like the antigen test. If somebody's positive in there, now you're going back and retesting again. So from my perspective, with where we are today, you're probably better off to do a saliva test for each one of those individuals right now and for the next year before you would look at something like that as you start having to figure out how to find the budget to do that. So I think that could be a long-term solution that I wouldn't recommend currently, but that's just right. That's me. I'm not. As far as the wastewater and all, that's not an area we are. I do believe we have a faculty member in that research area that's doing some of that. I think that's, again, as you're trying to get into how this disease spreads and so forth, I think there's some merit to that. I would just say where we're focused on and what we're doing is really in the testing area and really trying to help those people that have been affected by how do I make house payments, how do I take care of my kids, how do I do that? That really became the critical issue for us with the MDL lab. I think these other issues are as important as we start to understand how the disease is spread and what we need to do to protect ourselves, but that's not an area we're focused on.
I appreciate your answers. I guess in our case, the individual saliva therapy actually wasn't approved, at least up in our area at the time. And so it was easier to do pooled testing. And then once you had that, then they did individual testing. At that time, they had to resort then to the swab. But now they could do individual saliva testing. And that seems fairly reasonable?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, totally, 100%.
Yep. Thank you.
Yep.
Representative Reese.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is about the pre-procedure for the COVID testing, you know, where you can't eat and brush your teeth for 30 minutes before. What is the rationale behind that? I mean, I can logically think about what it would be.
So, you're getting into your sampling saliva, and what that does is increase your chances of having indeterminate result, right? So I don't know if you've gotten one of those, but there's nothing better than getting tested and then getting the result back that says, we don't know, right? Do it again. So that 30 minutes helps eliminate that need to say, hey, we have an indeterminate result, test again.
Thank you.
Representative Lynn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Looking forward, PCR machines, last I knew, cost several $1,000s to do, but the machine itself. But looking forward, is there any thought about getting these to maybe some of the larger doctor's offices so that they can actually run these in-house? Because it only takes a couple hours for a PCR machine, or the PCR to actually be run.
So here's what I would say is, yes, that's going to happen. But more importantly, I think what we did at their lab, and I'm glad you asked this question because it's something I forgot to say. When we were partnering with these medical companies, they're very good at developing the science and the research to test for COVID, right? What they are not good at is how do you maximize a laboratory to get through as many tests as you can. So one of the advantages that Wichita State brings to the table is its work in robotics, its work in innovation. So we create the high throughput through innovation, right? So what we can do in our lab, and most labs and doctors' offices, they may want to test COVID and this and a few tests of a lot. We said we need a high throughput, lots of tests. So what we can do and offer those doctors' offices, we can do a ton of them, so they don't need to make that investment. And number two, because of the innovation and how we're doing it, the test is much cheaper than most places that are doing it. So actually, I think there is a benefit to having a centralized location in this particular case. But there may be a reason a doctor's office or somebody wanted to have that. And, sure, they can make that investment if they wanted to.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Are there further questions? Representative Haswood.
Where I work, we have the recommendation of getting tested 7 days since your most recent day of contact. Is that a piece of information that's still accurate? Does it depend on each health department or organization?
So, me speaking, I don't know what accuracy is. I've been in meetings where I've been informed that it doesn't matter if you test or not. It's 14 days. It's 24 days. I've been in meetings where I was told, absolutely, we don't care if they test negative. It's a 14-day quarantine. And then have New York Times on my watch tell me we just changed it to 7, right? So I think what's happening in the health field is they're looking at history and we're trying to be safe. Right? What I am saying is testing helps us get more information so we can give these health people better information, right? So I would say, and this is what we did, and this is again talking to Tanya, and not saying we're the experts in what's going on here, but why not test in 3 days, Andy? Why not test in another 3 days? Why not test again at 7 days, and let's see what happens? And so that's what we did, right? That's how we found out our son went from positive to negative in less than 7 days, right? And that's how we learned that none of us tested positive through that whole piece. And we're still testing today just to make sure before we leave the house and so forth that we don't have those symptoms. So from my perspective, especially when we're dealing with money coming from the federal government to allow every Kansan to test, why not test every 3 to 5 days?
I just caution because I looked at the data, the incubation period is several days, and then to prominently, save our dollars is that 5 to 7 day range where the COVID virus would prominently show on the tests. But then also we have issues of people who get a negative test and then they're out partying right after.
Totally agree, right? Totally agree. That's why I'm sitting here saying we would tell somebody if they've had an exposure not to test the next day, wait 3 to 5 days, but not just do that one test to test again, right? But there needs to be an abundance of caution while you're doing that. You're still not going out in public with that exposure. Absolutely correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Bishop.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Andy, I may be putting you on the spot because I have a feeling this may not be in your purview, but I am curious. We have the Go Get Tested program, and I'm assuming that the purpose of that is to find how much asymptomatic positives we have out there. Do you think that's the purpose, or am I wrong?
Well, so I was listening to Secretary Azar, right, was speaking the other day, and so these are his data, not my data, that more than 50% of the people who test positive for COVID don't have symptoms, right? And so if that's the case, and he was basically saying, if you have symptoms, assume you have COVID, stay home, right? We can test you if you want, but you shouldn't be out in public. The real issue becomes, and the only way we're going to actually get an understanding of this test is to test asymptomatic people, especially if you can be positive and not have any symptoms at all. So that becomes absolutely critical. 100% agree with that.
So it might be good for us to get an update from KDH&E at some point as to how that's coming, whether there are any findings that are valuable thus far. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yep.
All right, committee, are there further questions? Representative Turner.
Say, kind of building off of Representative Lenz and Representative Bishop's. So I would agree that it seems like there's economies of scale of doing it in your shop, you're specialized in that. And she's talking about some programs that kind of drive that. So I guess my question is, you talked about having a capacity of 6,000 and you're operating about 25. Why is there unmet capacity given all of those things?
Because honestly, I think there's a lot of confusion. Do I test? Do I not test? I don't want to, right? I don't want to waste money. I don't want to do this. You know, in the case of where my son works, I don't want to test and find out, right? I don't want to know, right? So I think all of that plays into it. The other piece is you have to scale, right? I mean, when we first talked about this lab, we wanted to build a lab that could do 20,000 tests a day. And then just talking about funding and what it would cost, we went, because we had to make all the investments ourselves as a university, and it's not been a great time that there's a lot of extra money at a university. We felt it was important. So we scaled to a place we thought was a place to be. So I will tell you that November 15th, we're not doing maybe 100 tests a day. And by the time Thanksgiving happened, we were doing 1,000 tests a day. And today we're doing 2,500. We've been as high as 3,500. And that's only going to continue to grow, right? But it just takes a while for people to get comfortable. It takes a while for people to understand where to go. And it takes a while to get 500 organizations trained and up to speed. So that was why I was very happy that the federal government extended that timeline, because to think that you could start on November 15th and test 1 million people by December 31st and add a week of Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's and think you're going to get to 1 million tests, you're not. So that extra timeline will help us get where we need to be. So I think we'll continue to see that growth as it continues to get out and become easier for people to test. I mean, I'm just telling you, I'm not waiting 30 minutes in a line of cars to get a PCR test. Just not going to do it. So how do we make it easier for people?
Yeah, and I think, and that was kind of behind my question earlier. I think there's a lot of folks that think if they get tested and it becomes positive that they're on a registry and they're, you know, it's just going to create a lot of havoc in their life, and so they prefer just to not be tested.
Yeah.
So.
And and again, this is personal, right? I will tell you the fact that we could test every 3 to 5 days allowed us to make decisions based on data and not on fear. Because with fear, I'm just telling you, we would have been staying home and worried, and we would have been convinced we hadn't been waiting to go to the hospital, right? And, now we're frustrated we never got it. I mean, honestly, I don't want to get it, but we're still dealing with now we need to test and so forth. So, but that data and knowledge is helpful.
Are there further questions? Representative Berquist.
In going and donating blood, Madam Chair, they test by blood, and I don't hear that talked about. I hear about oral and nasal. Can you tell any what the difference is? I know you're not a MD, but that's okay.
But I wanted to be a doctor.
I know you did.
No, I didn't.
Cool glasses, though.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, thank you. So my understanding is the blood test is the antibody test. So what you're doing is you're testing for antibodies at that time. So you need to wait till you have the disease and so forth and see. So like us, again, in our personal case, my wife and I both were like, there's no way we didn't get COVID from our son. And then she just had the antibody test last week, and she tested negative for antibodies. So that's what the blood test is doing. And that's one of the things I think is really going to be a next step forward with Johns Hopkins is once that becomes a saliva-based test, it's going to be easier to do that antibody test. So you're not waiting for your physical or whatever when you take blood to find out what the antibodies are.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there further questions? Andy, I've got a few here for you. I think, one of the questions here is, all right, we hear that you're testing. We know that the state has hired a company to do testing. So I'm, average Kansas citizen, how do I know where to go get tested besides going to my doctor or to the ER, and then that's when you end up with an insurance copay?
Yeah, right. And so I think on the KDHE website, they're supposed to be putting where you test. I think right now they only have the company you're talking about on there, so we would want to be on there and make people aware of how to do that. If you would go to wichita.edu and type in the MDL, we have a frequently asked questions on how to sign up to become a partner. So, and it's not that hard to do. It's pretty simple, and we can mail you stuff, and you can start testing your workers or if it's your church or whatever it happens to be. But there's got to be a better system of how we inform people of what's happening and who they're doing. And the one thing I would just say, the one thing that our lab's doing, and I think there's a couple others, is that the lab is in Kansas. Kansans are prioritized, and you're getting the results in 24 hours. Going someplace where you have to wait 3 to 5 days for results makes no sense.
Okay, so you said something that was very interesting then. So it doesn't have to just be, quote, a business as we think of the typical business out there. It could be organizations or your church.
Yep.
Could it even be if you had a large homeowners association that they could decide to do that? Okay. The other question I have is, because the other company that you probably don't want to mention, but I don't go by any rules, is Well Health, I believe is the name of it. And they're paid for the collection process, and it's my understanding that's around the $50. What are you paid for on collections?
0.
So all those volunteers,
Correct.
the state's not having to pay that $50? Okay.
Correct.
And then the cost of the test to a business is?
0.
Because the state's paying for it?
The state's paying for it.
All
That's
right.
correct.
The state is paying WSU how much for this test?
So the test itself was around $40, and now we're including FedEx overnight, so people outside of our area who can't drive to our lab can mail it in, so now it's at $59.
All right, and it's my understanding, if you don't have the information on this, you don't have to. It's my understanding that the other testing company, Well Health, that the state's paying them $160 for the same test.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about
And
that.
it's taking 4 to 5 days, whereas you are less than 24 hours.
I can tell you what our costs are, and I can tell you we get the test turnaround in less than 24
Right.
hours. Yeah.
Well, and I can vouch for that because I had had a grandson that tested positive, so that gave me a contact. We quarantined. My quarantine was over on the Friday before leadership elections, and it was nice to be able to go out and have that test done and know that night whether or not I was positive or not. So are you doing, so the testing that you're doing that the state's paying for, that's for these businesses or these organizations? Are you also then testing the employees and students on campus?
Yes.
So any of them can come and
Yep.
there's probably designated areas to go?
Yep. Yeah.
But the average individual citizen of, say, Sedgwick County or surrounding area cannot do that? Or
They
can
can,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely, right? So that's, again, as more people are doing this, what we're trying to do is capture where are people, right? So this isn't about testing businesses, this is about testing the community. So the question becomes, where's the community from 8 to 5 or, and so if a majority of people are at work, then how can we reach the community where they work, right? How can we reach the community where they go to school? That becomes critical. And then what you do for the schools are, right, or that company, hey, the employee might be super safe, but what's happening to the spouse? What's happening to the kids? Do they get tested as well? So they offer those tests to families. Again, what we call the bubble, because everybody has to be safe and secure in order for this to work. So yes, there's a lot of flexibility in there.
So we can go onto Wichita State's website and get that information
Yep.
to share with our constituents?
Actually, I can get you that link and you can
Okay,
share it with
that would be
everybody.
good.
Yeah.
If you'll get that sent to Carmen, I'd appreciate
Yep.
it. Committee, are there further questions out there? I believe you, Representative Kelly?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And how about when you get down into small areas of Kansas. I've got some in southeast Kansas. Can individuals one-on-one make contact with WSU and get something sent to them, or does it take someone that's been a trained volunteer collector?
So you need a trained volunteer collector. So I will tell you, in some of these rural areas, and we can talk afterwards.
Microphone, Andy, please, I'm sorry.
I'm going to talk to you with my back turned to you, if that's okay. Which is very awkward. But so especially in the rural areas, we could talk to you, find an organization or a group or a church or a school, get them trained so that you could train and test other people. So one of the things we did is we were dealing with Sedgwick County. They had their own testing facility and they weren't sure they wanted to switch to us. Was actually one of the commissioners got trained. And so he actually goes into his district at night and on weekends and test people in his district. So there's lots of ways we can figure out how to help you. And then now with the FedEx overnight, we can get that back in a day and get that result back. Obviously, it's 24 hours when it hits the lab, so it would be about a 2-day turnaround if you're using FedEx. But there's absolutely a way to make sure we can get those rural areas taken care of.
And I believe, Andy, if I recall correctly, is there's a portal that you get signed up to.
That's right.
In order to get the test results. So you're not waiting for somebody to call you.
That's
You can
right.
go and check on that portal. Committee, are there any further questions or comments? I believe you may have brought a special guest here today. Would you like to introduce her to us?
Sure, and I'm sorry. This is Tanya Witherspoon. So as we talk about this lab, she's the brainchild behind the idea. She came to me and said, hey, what if we did this? And I was like, it's a great idea. I'm not sure this is what the university should be doing, but I'm really glad she pushed and persisted. And the meeting she had with people at Harvard and the Stowers Institute and so many of these medical places, in really getting to have an appreciation for what Wichita State could bring in the areas of advanced manufacturing, automation, and innovation was all her. So, I mean, if the lab is fabulous. Every day I wake up going, oh my God, something bad's going to happen. And I've been telling everybody how great the lab is, and I've never had that call. So she's just done a fabulous job. She's a wonderful person, and thank you for making sure I
Tanya, is there
recognized her.
comments that you would like to make? You've had to stand here, and we know that Andy sometimes gets a little off kilter there. So is there any comments that you'd like to share with us? No, step up to the microphone, please. And if you'll say your name and spell it so my staff has it for our minutes.
My name's Tanya Witherspoon, TonyWitherspoon. I want to sign your school up. Okay, we can get you free testing for all your faculty, your community, everybody, all of you. So really, we're using the CARES dollars to help Kansas. And right now it's free, and we want all of you to sign up so that we can train you. Training takes about 1 hour on a Zoom call. Okay, that's it. It is, just like Dr. Antonio said, it's very important that the specimen be collected correctly. It's not really that hard to teach someone to spit, but, we take you through the steps.
It's hard to spit. I'm just going to say, when you haven't been able to drink for 30
Yes,
minutes.
it is. So, we take you through the steps to make sure you're getting a quality specimen. We make sure that, you can answer some basic questions. And then we have a medical team that will help you with strategy. So like your question of, how often you should test, all of that. A lot of those decisions change when you have access to testing regularly, right? And the amount of money, because we're a university and we're doing this, at a nonprofit price, $34 is the cost of the test that we put together. That's all the reagents, that's the medical team, the facility, all of that. So it's not, I don't think it's a waste to test multiple times. I think it's a blessing to be able to do that. So, any organization that wants to take on the responsibility of learning, how to collect specimens, requisition them to our lab, and be a leader in their organization can sign up and work with us. So, and thank you. Thank you for letting us come and talk.
Questions for Tanya, Representative Bishop.
Thank you for coming, Tanya. I would like to just put in a word of commendation for the fact that we have such a good testing process right here in the House. And I was tested yesterday. It's in Blaine Finch's office. And the portal is absolutely fantastic. I'm waiting for it should be either later tonight or first thing tomorrow. And I think this is really valuable for us, and I intend to get tested when I arrive and get tested again when I leave. And I just would like to commend you, and I would like to give one little tip. This is an old Toastmasters tip. If you get up to give a speech and you have no saliva, you're going to have to do a Marco Rubio thing to grab. Chew on your tongue a little bit, very, very carefully. It works.
That's part of our training is wet your whistle, chew on your tongue, do something to get your saliva going. So very, very good. And then it doesn't take as long, really.
Oh, I thought Zach was just pulling my leg when he told me to do that. Representative Haswood?
I wanted to know, thank you, Madam Chair. What's the efforts of making sure that your training is in different languages?
We have our training in English, but our training materials in Spanish and Vietnamese. Those are the only two languages that we have translated things to at this point.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your effort in the community. I think increasing testing is something we definitely need to prioritize. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative Reese.
That was one of my questions about the language piece. I live in Johnson County in District 23 and have quite a diverse population within the district, and I'm trying to sponsor testing in the neighborhoods. There's a lot of apartments all around, and so I'm just trying to come up with ideas. And so you just gave me an idea of getting enough of us tested that are bilingual, and not tested, but training.
Right.
And then maybe we can do a group of us where we can create ways of being able to do the testing that way.
That would be fabulous. I would like, to work with you. And if there are other languages that, you think we could focus on, Spanish we did immediately. And we have people that speak Spanish in our lab that can help people, at all times. And then we did Vietnamese second. And we haven't had another request yet. We haven't had a deficit that's been brought to us, but having dual language trained collectors is the key.
And there are two churches just like down the street from where I live, and they're all nations denominations, but they're predominantly from different parts of Africa. I don't know how many languages are there, but it would be great if I could get a group of them to also.
It would be great.
Become testers.
The second thing after getting a good collection specimen that we really stress and train people is how to do it safely. So the saliva is completely self-administered. So it's very important that the person that's observing and helping stays 6 feet away, doesn't touch anybody, you set everything up correctly. And we spend quite a bit of time making sure that we, help, because we don't want to have a super spreader at one of our collection sites. So anyway, those are probably the two things, and at a church with dual language would be perfect. Cool. We have a lot of churches that have already, signed up, and different boys and girls clubs and schools and, nonprofit organizations, all kinds of different groups.
Okay, well, I'll get in touch with you.
Good, absolutely great.
Well, I'm thinking that because this is out on the World Wide Web is that we may hit your capacity here in not too long. So the question I have for you, what is the capability of expansion beyond 6,000 a day?
So if we need to, and CARES funding would be available to help us, because of course Wichita State can't pay for that. It's a matter of buying more equipment and staffing additional people, and we can do that. From the beginning, we have planned that is a possibility and something that might need to happen. So we're not there yet, but we definitely could. We also, as Andy said, we're right now testing just for coronavirus, but we're working with the CDC's multiplex assay, which means that with one specimen, we can test for flu A, flu B, RSV, and coronavirus. And then as Andy said, we're working with Johns Hopkins University that already has an approved antibody test for saliva, which would mean, again, with one specimen, we'd have to run 2 different tests because the antibody test is looking for protein. It's different than a PCR test, but we still, just with one specimen, could give you results for all of that. And this year, we will have all of that because we'll need it, right? I mean, the state will need it to stay healthy.
So you have the space, it would just be the
Yes.
equipment and the staff. It
Absolutely.
Seems like to me that, if we went from paying $160 for one test, because you're doing 3 for that, actually, you're doing 3 and a partial one for that kind of money, as we could pay for that equipment. Representative Epley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to distill this down, what's your false positive rate and false negative rate? If you said that, I missed that. I mean, you have to know that if you do that many tests.
Yeah, we do. So there's 2 things that people look for in a test. One is specificity and the other is sensitivity. Specificity is whether it can detect the specific thing you're looking for, and our PCR tests are 100% specific, which means that if it's positive, it's absolutely coronavirus. The sensitivity is how much of the virus needs to be amplified, or in your gene to actually be detected. And our saliva test is 94.6% sensitive.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there further questions? All right, seeing none, thank you very much. We appreciate you being here today to come up here and add to the testimony that Andy provided us today.
Thank you for your time and inviting us.
You
Appreciate
bet.
it.
Yeah, I think one of the things, committee, just more of a comment, was, some of the decisions that the Sparks Committee versus what the CARES Committee made, I think has also, delayed some things where we could have maybe done more expansion had the money come through that the Sparks Committee recommended versus what the CARES Committee decided to do. And the fact that we've gone to an outside consultant outside the state, we've gone to a lab that's technically outside the state, and that those tests that Well Health, I believe it is, those are shipped to Texas, and then we get the results in about 4 or 5 days. So those are, things that we have to be concerned with. Committee, I had told you yesterday that I would have the rules and the conferee rules for you today. We still do not have that. I do not blame Carmen. She is, like I explained the other day, she's brand new for this committee. We've had technical after technical after technical, so hopefully by next week, we will have the rules. If you're really anxious to see what they look like, the bulk of them would be the same rules as last year, except for some addition on how we handle the WebEx meetings, et cetera, on that type of stuff. You will also notice once the technology is all worked out that we will be paperless. So you will get that information to whatever email you have supplied for Carmen to send that to. I would recommend that you open it before you come into the committee, because it does come to you via email, is that you open it and you download it. And then according to what IT's telling me, you should be able to mark it up from there on your state laptop computer. And then that keeps you from having these great big thick folders. If you really want a folder really bad, Carmen can give you one, and then you can be responsible for it throughout this committee process. But it just saves staff a lot. It saves a lot in paper. I like the capability of being able to do a word search. I don't know how many of you, I know we've got a lot of new ones, but you've sat there, and I remember Representative Sawyer and I were sitting in the K-12 budget a few years ago, and we had 2 of those folders like this. And we were all sitting in the committee trying to find one piece of testimony in those folders. So this really saves you that ability to do it. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer it or go over the technology process with you at any time. But we do have, we'll have a presentation next week, and I believe, was it Tuesday and Wednesday? She'll have that out on the agenda. But anyway, we're going to have a meeting 2 days next week to be presented the Mental Health Modernization Task Force report. And the reason we have to do 2 days is because it's a few hundred pages. But there was a lot of work from some great people all around the state of Kansas helping us do that. And then one day, and we'll get that out to you, so we're going to have a joint meeting with the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. and have Dr. Norman come and testify before us and give us an update. So, listen down your questions that you would have, that you've got concerns with or whatever, and he'll be here to give us an update. After that, the discussion that I've had with KDHE and with Senator Hildebrand is that we did not want to put an additional meeting on everyone because KDHE did want to take and do an update once a week with us in a joint status, but that would mean you've got 4 committees in one day, and when we can avoid that, we try to do that. Should we decide we need another joint one, then we'll be happy to schedule it, but at this time, we will not, except for next week. So I think that's everything, and guess what? We're adjourned.